Thank you everyone for joining us here for our Front 22 talks. We have with us Tony Coates and Sarah Oppenheimer, two fantastic artists who are working on a project both together here at Transformer Station, but one that will also extend out into the world in different ways. So I guess I'd just like to start by asking each of you, this is, for both of you, the second trip out to Cleveland, right? How was it? When was the first time you were here, Tony?
I think I was here in January of 2019 before all this craziness started. Or was it 2020?
2020, I think it was right before the...
Right before. Yeah, it was kind of, I was thinking about, the weather's different, thank goodness. And yeah, just, you could argue that most things, at least logistically, are a little bit different than the first time. It's a shorter trip, I guess, this time, I think. And the last time it was kind of more interactions, with people. And now it's kind of, the exhibition is here. And so it's an opportunity to talk to Sarah, and, to some degree. And so, it feels quite a bit different. But I think the biggest difference, of course, is the thing that we've all been through over the last year and a half. So.
For sure. And for you, Sarah? Are these the first times you've been to Cleveland, or have you spent any time here before?
So I've been to Cleveland in the past, and I think the last time I was here for Front was in the fall of 2019. And that was a really amazing experience, actually, because the visit really was an exploration of the city in a way that I've never had a site visit behave before. So the site somehow became really expanded, and it's interesting to come back and now feel like it's very concentrated. And to have so much have elapsed in the past year and a half is sort of a huge reorientation, but additionally, in the last year and a half, we've started to evolve a collaborative project, and that has meant that coming here has all sorts of really exciting possibilities and very specific questions. It's a very different kind of visit.
Well, it's true, because I think that when we started conversations with both of you, we were talking with both you, Tony, and Sarah about individual projects that would manifest themselves in the triennial. And it's really, I guess it's amidst the pandemic that the idea of doing something in a way that intersects, doing something collaborative came together. I'm curious, neither of you knew each other before this project. And so do you have any memory of what was your first impression when I think probably I said to you all, hey, do you want to meet another artist? You both happen to have a Providence connection, and I feel like your brains might, play well in a sand pit. I don't know, what was your impression? What did you think? Because you haven't worked collaboratively with other artists in that way, have you?
No, I was so excited, especially as I became increasingly familiar with your work, Tony. And it really, I think, has opened up a whole new line of inquiry for me, and also really extended existing lines of inquiry. So when that dialogue started to evolve, it just seemed really promising and like a big opening.
Yeah, it seemed like a great gift and surprise, not something that I expected. I think for me, it's been 20 years, since I was seriously involved in a kind of detailed set of collaborations. So, but I often recruit people or ask people to participate in projects of mine from time to time. And so it was kind of like, wow, this is something kind of from start to finish. It's not just, an occasional or a partial kind of thing, which was very, very exciting. I'm not sure exactly why you chose the two of us to work together, but in a certain way, I do feel that there are certain differences that might complicate and amplify each other's approaches to things. I know for me, that there's a kind of more participatory address, I think, that Sarah has, and a more kind of questioning of systems and ways of, presenting and organizing things. which is something that interests me and is part of my practice, but more kind of on the exhibition side, more on the installation side than it is like something I'm thinking about all along. It's almost like I tend to reorient my pieces, spatially, but this, seems like a potential to kind of incorporate the spatialization in a really, really intriguing way that I don't know whether I would even, think about it that way by myself. So that's interesting.
Well, it's a good question back to me. I think it's true. I'm trying to remember, why did I think I should introduce you to? I suppose that, well, first and foremost, you're both artists whom I deeply admire, and I loved your work. I also felt like the kind of provenance connection was just a random, maybe biographical fact, but somehow the fact that you've been a professor at Brown for a long time and you studied there made me think like, oh, that's like an incidental thing. But it was really that I think there's something about how each of you seems to think about structures. I had a hunch that, from some conversations with you, you had mentioned that your work, which is often architectural in scale and kind, had never been a display for another artist's work or another work. It was always the object of both that people would manipulate and change in a space. It was sculptural, but it thought a lot maybe about its surroundings, its context, but it didn't ever function in a way where it also incorporated another artist's work. And I think it was with your work thinking about some of our early conversations around the role of installation and the way that I think your work actually invites a real agency in the viewer because of the way that it uses music and text. Like, it makes the act of reading really active, and the music, the sound, kind of moves people literally. And so, but that's a kind of agency that I think comes through your videos in one way, and your work invites a different kind of agency, which is physically to change and alter the space of exhibition. So that was the hunch I had, and then I guess it's like a petri dish. I tried to bring you all onto a Zoom in the midst of a pandemic and see what would happen.
Well, it's interesting, the more I'm talking to you today, and really over this period, but really interestingly today, I'm thinking about how language, and this goes back to this connection, that my thinking about language is really a result of thinking about a kind of semiotic play. And that is really in some ways very much outside of how I work, but it isn't outside of how I deal with iteration and structures. And so to suddenly have reading and text and the agency of reading intertwined with what I'm doing is so fascinating. And even I'm just thinking about our short conversation moments ago, where you could read across works depending on how they spatially touch each other or not, so that instead of them being self-contained, they become one and they disconnect, and that reading across is a function of how other people are interacting with it. It's fascinating because we read across spaces and we read across kind of open and closed locations, and we read across light and dark, but reading across a text introduces this whole symbolic universe into my work that I've never dealt with at all, and it's really exciting.
Well, it's true, because I guess that in your work, I'm putting language onto it, so you should tell me when I'm getting it wrong. But I don't think about your work as foregrounding narrative. Is that a true statement, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it doesn't foreground the symbolic, which means, and if we locate narrative there, then I would say you were right, I think.
Because there's also a way in which your work really can function forward and backwards. Like, I think about the motions of many of your works. You've often talked about doors as structures, and they kind of open and close.
So to say something about narrative, which is, if we don't think of narrative as necessarily linear, or if we think of it as like segments of phase time, and we can think of gaming, the narrative of, let's say, VR gaming worlds as sort of open play structures, then narrative becomes something else. But if we think of narrative like, let's say, an early novel structure where you're basically reading from beginning to end, it is not. But what's interesting about Tony's project, it seems, is that the agency lies in it, and here I'm just giving a kind of
A reading.
A reading. A reading of the reading.
A reading
of the act of reading, that there's the possibility of this kind of shuffling of language.
I would definitely say that I'm not committed to, a traditional through line of either narrative or argument. Often I use documentary materials. It's interesting, I rarely use literature, but there's a tendency to kind of rework and fragment the existing text, or transcript. I've become sometimes fascinated by what it means to read something which was said, and to read it maybe in fragments or in different contexts, or at different scales, and as some of my viewers remind me today, in different constellations than one would read it normally. It's sort of like, I do have I'm trying to work against the sort of atomization of readership and trying to encourage, fragmented readings, rewoven readings, readings that could occur in public as opposed to individually and in private. And I think maybe part of that is what draws me to the interactive aspects of your work, is that it kind of constitutes a different relationship to the act of reading or the act of making sense of spaces, let's say, than as individuals, isolated individuals, always having a particular type of function in relationship either to a structure or a text. And I am interested in opening up the possibilities of reading for, sometimes I'm drawn to texts that have already had readings. And so it's almost like a restaging or reshuffling of something that already exists and has been read. And sometimes I think maybe it's to emphasize or to ask questions about what it is that we think we know, and what is it that we think we understand from the things that we've encountered.
That is so relevant to how, that's so relevant and interesting to me, because I've been thinking about the problem of wholes and parts, and how our sense of the whole is not because it is one, complete, but it has to do with a kind of gestalt perception. And so the possibility of dissociation and reassociation, of tying the fragment to a whole and disassociating the fragment and then tying the fragment to a different whole, has been how I've been thinking about it spatially, but never in terms of text or reading or a social body through reading. So that's really helpful, actually, for my own thinking about how to imagine this project. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, in a kind of very simple, structural way, I think I, at least as a young maker, was drawn to Godard's old aphorism, I have beginnings, middles, and ends, but not exactly in that order. It's sort of like, so you'll be able to recognize, certain functions almost from fragments, right? But, I'm not going to present the fragments in the same order that they originally appeared necessarily, because it's more to think about maybe what the functions are of some of these, short things. Sometimes, I read for certain things in text, a text that may or may not have anything explicitly to do, say, with race. I might go through the text and only find those moments where race is a subject. And it's like, it's not really what the book is about, but on the other hand, it is a part of the book. And so these fragments sort of tell a story not necessarily a linear story, a kind of fragmented story, maybe autobiographical material or historical material, but that idea that, you know, it's not about wholes, it could be just as well about fragments.
Give me 1 second. I think we need to tell them to turn off the vent. Otherwise, I mean, we can keep rolling, but let's just keep rolling, but I don't. What? Oh, you can?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. I mean, I just thought like sound-wise, but the
Yeah.
point about reading, I mean, sorry, I didn't want to break, but I assume that we can somehow cut something into this to make it come together. But I was also going to say there is a thing about reading. I mean, the thing that's interesting about reading too is reading an exhibition space. I often think as an exhibition maker about what it means to read an exhibition space, and I can't remember who said this. Oh, it was, so in the work that I've done over the years about the East German graphic designer and exhibition maker Klaus Wittkugel, in some of the literature from the 1960s about his work making these propaganda exhibitions, the work is talked about as a montage, as a kind of, you know, an avant-garde montage in space. And so the question of how you, and in German, maybe it's also the same in English, though I'm not sure. In German, for an exhibition, you actually have an exhibition script, which is the same word that's used for the Drehbuch, which is the same word for, drehen is to film. It's the same word for a film script or a film score. And so, but there's something about a space and how you read an exhibition space and the moves in that, but how your work thwarts that in a particular way, because you walk in with the expectation that you get to see an exhibition in a single state, and then suddenly you it's almost like a kind of Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Once you move in and you start to move it, you can no longer see yourself as separated from what happens in the space. And the kind of montage that happens over time as you watch your films in these different sequences starts to do something there.
So I have a comment about that, the metaphor of montage, because I've recently been thinking about Faroki's sort of renunciation of montage, which I think is a really interesting move in his later life, to have, insofar as I understand it, to say that, you know, montage it's an older art, but now we have this kind of fabricated digital image. And so there's a totally different way of making truth meaning. And it's interesting to think of this as a creation rather than a cut, so that the meaning making isn't in the removal, it's in the actual building or in the constructing of this new thing. So I'm excited about imagining this as a kind of generative process more than in a way as like an edit.
Right. It's more happening like in camera or before the camera. It's like a thing that's happening in the world.
In the medium.
Yeah.
It's happening in the medium. It's like in the construct of the image is the making of the new world. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting also in terms of this process, because it's in a way how this process of dialogue is already unfolding, but it's, you know, what's happening like here in this room, like as we're trying to figure out what the work is in real time in conversation, and then that'll be mirrored in some ways by what people experience in this exhibition in less than a year's time. Okay, that's turned off. That makes me so much happier now. Maybe it doesn't make a difference, but
Well, we can hear each other.
now
yeah,
we can, yeah.
it feels better.
What were you going to say, Tony? You were
I was just going to maybe make a general comment that, you know, there is something about, at least from my perspective, incorporating spaces other than the sort of flat screen space in which these works are composed in. That's really, really interesting to me. I think at this maybe moment in time, in a certain sense. I mean, I'm also thinking maybe a bit in the other direction, like making books or making posters, things that are kind of more maybe traditionally 2D graphic, but at the same time I'm also trying to figure out what happens when these materials get, I don't know whether they're edited or juxtaposed or recomposed in relationship to spaces, as opposed to just the screen. I, have nothing, it's sort of like part of my production method, and I'm, very used to it. But I've always also been interested in the kind of fungibility that you build something in one scale, and what happens to it if it gets distributed or projected or made into something more object-like than where it was originally, conceived and organized. So.
Well, I'm so excited, as I was saying before, to think about these as light projections, because that makes for a moving light projection makes for basically not just a moving object in space, but a whole, like the whole boundary of the space is going to start to shift, and the perceived sort of closeness and farness of everything in the whole space, and also the light bleed, what happens to sort of the ambient light, or if these, if they start to cross directionally. So the spatial complexity of these moving projectors, in my mind, is just so rich and
yeah,
surprising.
and I think some of the effects are surprising. I know that when I think I was talking to you when we did the LED pieces, like I knew because I had seen it demonstrated in a kind of workshop situation that, well, these are extreme color casts. But it was like, I didn't quite know how extreme they would be in an actual space. I didn't know, for instance, what would happen if you painted a wall in either, complementary or the same color, and whether it would intensify or whatever from the bleed. Those kinds of things are really exciting. It's like, certainly when I was initially making the works, I wasn't thinking about what would happen if you made it into a light emitting, phenomena and that was, presented in a space at architectural scale. It was kind of like, kind of whole new world, even though, it's like, it's on a certain level, it's like, I'm sure, through practice that you can incorporate these knowledges. But it was really, really kind of an adventure to think that, it's not the thing in a certain way that I made, that the presentation of it and the change of scale kind of changes, what it is that you're doing, its, legibility, even, how it's constituted or how it's described. Like people, in reviews of that show, people talked about my work as a colorist. It's sort of like, well, I've been working, with color for a long time now, but it was something about the physicality, and the color bleed as much as anything else, I think. There was the color, and then there was, the reciprocal effect of the color in a space.
Well, it makes me think that what you said about, the question of screens and the ubiquity of screens, particularly now over the last couple of years, but what it makes me think about, and this is an unformed thought, so I'm putting it into the space to try and see what happens when it encounters others, is that in both the cases of your work, well, and your work in some ways too, but differently, I think, the screen is the place of origin. It's where, or it's where it's produced. And when you see it then, on a computer, for example, you're almost like, you're experiencing it for better or actually maybe for worse.
Maybe for worse.
I think for worse, in its kind of native environment of construction, versus once it's, as you say, projected, made into LEDs or something else, there's a relationship that might be closer to a score and a performance. It's like the work that exists as a film is a score, but then it kind of enters into the space and it's performed in its instantiation as an installation or an exhibition. I remember early in our conversation, so probably in 2019, you shared with me some of the footage and documentation of your work in the Ruhr and projecting your work onto these different kind of surfaces. That kind of made
Shaped
it,
surfaces.
exactly, that kind of, again, it takes it as a score and performs it in a different way. And I'm thinking about that now in your work, like the relationship of score and performance, and the way in which you both create your work digitally in models, but then also really intensively prototype it, as I've seen you do in your space and in your studio, and kind of what happens between that space of conceiving the thing digitally and then that space of like making it and prototyping the space, and then what happens again in the next phase once it's scaled up or changed and becomes part of an experience in an exhibition.
Yeah, and there's a yet another layer there, which I think is going to be really fascinating as we explore this, which is then once it's here, effectively, its performance is actually never the same. Because as people touch it and people will be playing back Tony's work through these instruments in all different sort of relationships to each other all the time.
Right, you call your work instruments.
Yeah.
Right.
When did you start to call your work instruments?
They really started to be called instruments when I started to work through these linked networked systems. And it largely came about because I wanted to move the work, I wanted to demarcate the piece as the apparatus within it rather than sort of the shell that was holding it, so that to have the infrastructure bared or to have the infrastructure clad was actually not going to impact the integrity of the instrument.
Right. But it also, I mean, of course, apologies for only now realizing this because you've been sending me texts on instruments for years. But it's like, of course, an instrument is one apparatus. It's a tool that is played in all of these ways. And what's interesting is that it starts to, for me, have this resonance of, so in that metaphor, then you are the maker of the guitar. You are the maker of the fine instrument that's played by other people. But I also think that there's a way in which Tony might start playing it within this collaborative context, and you yourself as an artist are playing it as well.
That's right, and there's also another meaning to instrument, and I'm thinking of a barometer, for example.
Right.
It's that which is measuring the environment.
So it's both, yeah, that makes sense. So it's both a register of the environment and a thing that actually performs in another way. I mean, and the question of instrument, of course, connects me back to your work and to quite literally music in that context. But both context, a barometer of the times, which metaphorically we could talk about also in the way that your work thinks about, urban politics or structures of power or other things, but then literally in the way that your relationship to music. I mean, I'm curious, have you ever performed or played music? Were you ever in a band, or what was your relationship to that?
I was once in a band.
What did you play?
I was not an instrumentalist for the most part. I actually was a singer, because that is the kind of thing that I had done successfully in the past. I don't know, I've never really mastered an instrument as such. I don't quite know why. I mean, I've experimented with some electronic instruments, but still haven't, found the right one or the right measure. I have, of course, friends who tell me that they can teach me to be a bad DJ in, one afternoon. I have never really taken them up on it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a really attractive offer.
Yeah, it's like, I would want to take it seriously and want to, I don't know, deploy it in a particular way. I mean, although I do, mixes like for soundtracks of pieces, but they're really like, they're unorthodox in the sense that I don't beat match, I don't, fade one thing into another often. Or if I do, it's a very, simple, give me 1 second transitions between this and this. As opposed to, stretching it out or making them more durational or making, longer multi-track cuts of things. But music is a kind of important marker for me, and one of the things I was going to mention in relationship to the things that you were just saying are sort of ways of marking and deforming time. Like I tend not to work in the same musical period as the thing that I'm presenting or talking about. Sometimes, rarely I do, but more often than not, I'm looking for, some kind of supplementary or some sort of additional context and meaning in relationship to a text. So often, especially if I'm working, say, on a historical text, my tendency would be to pick something very contemporary that I'm listening to at the time when I'm making the piece. And I've, often thought about that, because it's sort of like, well, the classical way would be to pick something from the period that might have actually been heard by the people or at the time when the events being described happened. And I sort of feel like, well, I don't know, maybe that's a bit lazy, because in a certain sense, one of the things I enjoy about music is that it does have a kind of elastic temporality, and that it's a way of making the past present. And that's one of my fascinations personally with recorded sound, that it's historically been used, often by marginalized people, as a kind of technology, and you could say as a substitute for writing and painting, if you would. And so I maybe try to keep those traditions alive in some small way by making it an important component of most of the things that I do. By the way, I'm thinking about what place music will have, if any, in the things that we're doing, because, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's good to be in a space of uncertainty with regard to one's own habits. I mean, I think it could function. We were talking about, moving sound physically as well as moving, say, projections physically.
It's like the Doppler effect.
A kind of, Doppler effect, or, strange displacement or coming together between image and sound. It might function.
Well, what you're saying about music is so expansive, and it also, it's making me think that one of the things that has been absent in my work is the time container, that beautiful time capsule that you're describing music performing in. I think actually by having, even without music, your work has its own time. It's the writing, the language is a time capsule also.
Yeah.
And that
structure, tempo, often is a kind of important, is it too fast, a little too fast? Is it much too slow? Those things can have real impacts on reading, and the legibility of the text. So, yeah.
I'm also just thinking of where the texts are, the fragment itself is its own time capsule.
Yeah, it is.
And that there's a kind of present time to what I'm doing that means that there's no time capsule. So suddenly your work is bringing this non-present time in this really interesting way. Like, how do we create compression?
Right.
I'm immediately associating this with an idea about people's relationships to traumatic memories, which is interesting. That one account for how people's bodies respond to triggers that relate to PTSD or traumatic memories is that it's almost like a time machine, because your body goes directly back to the time in which you experienced that trauma. And so it's like your body has just been transported back to that moment. Whereas non-traumatic memories are reintegrated into your experience. And so when you encounter something that reminds you of that, it kind of remains part of where you are, as opposed to kind of taking you back in that time. But I think what you're saying about music that's also very true is that there's something so powerful about it as a mode, because I can hear a song that I might recognize from somewhere, and like smell, like other things, it immediately kind of brings me back to that moment. And unless I've encountered it many times since then, it brings me right back there. But you're right that is, it's a way to like locate time, and your work actually is kind of much more shifty, like it kind of moves back and forth. I mean, even you often draw these oscillation diagrams, and those kinds of diagrams are not about any linear conception, even though there is a time scale if you look at them on an x-axis, because it's actually cyclical. It's a cyclical structure that neither moves forward nor back within its construct.
Right, it's a description of movement in the
Movement.
present.
Yeah.
And to overlap the movement in the present with temporal, historical times that are locked in media, be it sound, be it language, be it film language, is really rich and expansive.
Yeah, I like the idea of taking something that appears to be fixed or to have one direction of flow and to oscillate it, you know, to re-oscillate that thing. And so it has multiple times kind of inscribed within it, you know, implications of a forward movement, but also implications of reversibility or a loop.
That's also really interesting because the whole language of a loop and the structure of a loop is so different in our work.
Right.
But it then has the potential to kind of overlay, where your loop and my loops start to bleed into each other.
Yeah. Yeah. There was also another structure that we were that came up in our conversation earlier. It's like when, I can't remember, phasing. When two loops meet and they kind of reintegrate and recompose one another, which is, I think, a fascinating idea about, and especially in terms of a way of maybe working across disciplines and practices.
Yeah, it seems like a really open way. If we can work out of phase and allow the phases to sort of drift in and out, then the collaboration becomes really fruitful because we're both able to sort of expand and contract our own material and yet enrich the other situations. Really great.
And you know, I've always liked the idea, especially in my own installation practice, of that kind of fixed works but non-repeatable. You know, that you walk in at a given point in time and then you're called to leave at another point in time, and someone else comes in and they have, you know, a different constellation of material and meaning that they encounter. And the idea of maybe accelerating, you know, that process or reversing it or complicating it. Yeah, it's really exciting.
Well, this metaphor of phasing and being in and out of phase, like different, is the right term, would it be they would have different periodicities, or is that,
They
no?
could have
They
different
can
periodicity,
and
but they don't
often
need
do.
to.
But they-
I mean, I feel like my technical vocabulary on phasing needs a little bit of work. I'll have to learn from both of you. But it is that as a metaphor for, or even just a structure for thinking about a collaboration is really great because of how it does allow for that juxtaposition or friction, or the idea that, you know, you had said before, the point of it wouldn't, I'm paraphrasing, but maybe it wouldn't make sense to you to have a text from a period and then just have music from that period, because those two things would be, they'd almost be too in lockstep.
Too close. in a
Too
certain
close.
sense.
And that's exactly, I mean, actually, I mean, back to the question that you asked me, which was a good one, of why did I, what was my intuition to try and introduce you to? I think part of it was feeling like there was both maybe enough overlap in terms of maybe not work, but how you think maybe, but then enough difference in terms of what the actual output is. Because I mean, I actually think that oftentimes within, I mean, in my experience of collaborations, both positive and challenging, it's like oftentimes the positive ones are where we have enough difference that we can like recognize what we might learn with each other and where we can do different things, but it changes both of us. And sometimes the most challenging ones are where it's really close, where actually like if you look at it on a broad spectrum, you think almost the same thing, but it's that 5% that causes the real problem.
Yeah,
And
the
so,
almost.
yeah, so it'll be really interesting as we get more into this project to see where is that going in phase and where is it coming out.
The other thing I will say that's been amazing to be here with you, Tony, is that this space is going through its own changes with its own people, and so we're sort of fortunate to be able to land here and situate this collaboration in this
In
situation.
relationship to this space as it shifts. Yeah, that's often a rare opportunity. Usually you're working with fixed possibilities of spaces, or at least I tend to be. You're, I think, more kind of actually changing the nature of the space in which your work is integrated, which I find fascinating. It's like on the one hand, the spaces may be fixed to some extent, but it seems your operation is to unfix things or to set up new relations.
Well, it's wonderful when there's also, there are other things at work that allow for the unfixing.
Right.
So,
There are certain affordances for flexibility,
Well, that seems like a great place for us to, wrap up our conversation for now. I mean, we will see what are these affordances and what happens through this kind of conversation, which things are fixed and which things shift. But for me, it's been exciting already to see how this conversation seems to be extending and maybe also slightly changing or transforming the possibilities that seem there in each of your work.
yeah.
So, thank you.
definitely. Thank you.
So is there anything else that you want to add to before we kind of end this? Anything you feel that's been left unsaid?
I can't think of anything right now. The things that we've forgotten, we'll probably pick up in the work somewhere, as opposed to, it's like, what did I think? What else did I think?
Awesome. I'm really so glad we could all be here today. This is so great.
And yes, so much gets done physically here. That's
Exactly.
what you were saying before about how on email, all of these levels get lost. But I mean, this is actually what I was saying
Well,
last.
you're trying so hard to document them and present them, when it's much easier somehow temporally almost to kind of have a call and response. I say this, here are your questions. And instead of I'm trying to anticipate your question. I'm trying to, encode it in a certain way. And then, there's always another question, it seems. And so it just seems like it seems to be efficient to displace it into text. But in a strange way, it's easier to process in a more direct way, in a more exchange-based way. And maybe it's something about if you will, the physicality almost of language at that level that, kind of keeps it from being a conversation. And it's so much easier when you're actually trying to process it in real time. Sometimes you don't have, all the answers to, all the eventualities or possibilities or all the questions. But sometimes it avoids you going off on tangents that are irrelevant too. It's like, no, that's not what I meant. You can, it's like, I meant, something else, and then you can kind of hopefully speak a bit more adequately to that, as opposed to trying to work from your imagination and conceive of things that way. It's also strangely a lot of writing, in a weird way. It's sort of like you're sitting there trying to imagine, what the next question will be, and it's always something. It's kind of.
Yeah, it makes me think that it's almost this question of, I'm suddenly thinking about latency. I'm thinking about like latency in a kind of online call and the kind of delay that happens, but what we call synchronous communications like here. And then on the other end, I've been thinking for a while now about the act of, say, reading a book and annotating it as a conversation with a high degree of asynchronicity where I might be kind of creating something in response to something that was written 500 years ago. And I mean, I think there are affordances in both because the distance might allow me, and the fact that I'm never really going to get a response back from that person in a direct way, allows me a certain freedom of thinking. But on the other hand, what happens in this room with all the information that is there allows for a kind of collaboration to happen much in a more meaningful way. And it's also what I've realized even this week with this exhibition is that, you know, that is the thing about exhibitions. They actually physically bring people and objects and ideas into a space. And so there's something that happens with that conversation that's very different from the kind of asynchronous experiences that we're having online in which, you know, there's not as much rubbing up against each other.
This is so relevant to the work because it's making me think that if one, specifically when one touches something, when a person touches something and they immediately register an effect, there's a way that they can adapt to the thing they change. Just like when I am talking with you, Tony, and you tell me something, I can adapt to what I'm sort of seeing that as a dynamic cause and effect that we're throwing back and forth. And that is actually what I think is going to be so shocking to experience when the piece comes to be.
I'm looking forward to the shock.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this Front 2022 talk. Thank you to Tony, thanks to Sarah, and we're really excited to see what you all come up with here.